Um, Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm Lubna, and I work with the Word Lab and the library together. We host City Scripts, a series of monthly interactions around the urban, representing IIHS's commitment to public engagement. These monthly events will culminate in an annual 3-day festival in May. So we're excited to introduce our speakers for today's panel, Brave New Worlds, exploring South Asian sci-fi and fantasy writing. Um, Lavanya Lakshminarayan is the author of Analog Virtual and also The 10% Thief, which is out from Solaris Books in 2023. She's a Locus Award finalist and is the winner of the Times of India Author Award and the Valley of Words Award. Her fiction has appeared in a number of anthologies and magazines and has been translated into multiple languages. Lavanya is also an occasional game designer. She's built worlds for Zynga Inc.'s Farmville and Mafia Wars, tinkered with augmented reality experiences, and custom-built battle robots in her living room, among other game projects. Prashanth Srivatsa is a speculative fiction writer from Bengaluru. His debut fantasy novel, The Spice Gate, is scheduled to be published in fall 2023 from Harper Voyager. His works of short fiction can be found in magazines such as Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Reckoning, Dark Matter, and others. TG Shenoy is a reader, science fiction and fiction enthusiast, and a columnist whose writings have appeared in several publications, including Locus Magazine. He is the writer of India's longest-running weekly science fiction column, New Worlds Weekly, for Factor Daily, and the Spec Fix column in Bangalore Mirror. He is currently the creative director at Publicis Business, Leo Burnett. And the moderator for this evening, Anjali Alappat, is a writer and editor. She began her career as a journalist and has also worked in communications and publishing, both in the private sector and for nonprofits. She's edited more than 40 children's books and authored 2. She loves sci-fi and fantasy, writing for children, coffee, long-form journalism, dinosaurs, space, and the music of the 80s. She will fiercely defend the Oxford comma forever. Right, so I request you all to switch off your phones for the duration of the session. And we'll be taking questions in the end, so please wait for the mic to be passed to you before speaking. And I hand over to Anjali now.
Thank you for that really lovely introduction. And if I had known that their bios were going to be so professional, I wouldn't have said the bit about dinosaurs. So to kind of get things started, I would invite you guys to kind of tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you got started in this field. Lavanya, why don't you start us off?
This one works? Okay. Okay, thank you all for being here. It's so lovely to see you all on a Thursday evening through Bangalore traffic and everything else. I have always been drawn to speculative worlds. I remember as a child engaging with anything that had magic or the future that kind of broadened the horizons of what was possible. Whether it was realistically possible or not, immediately drew me into it. I felt the capacity for wonder in me kind of expand. Each time I engaged with the world didn't even have to feature humans, anything that told me there is more than what you see around you. And all you need to do to access it is let your imagination run free. That drew me in immediately. So, of course, I must point out at this point that growing up in the 90s and the 2000s in India, there was a very heavily skewed set of science fiction and fantasy that I could engage with, and it was mostly Anglophone, from the UK and the US specifically. So I grew up reading Tolkien and Asimov, and those were really canon for me because that's what I could get my hands on. And while times have changed, and I'm grateful that we have so much more available to us, that's where it all started for me.
Hi everyone, very nice to see you all here. Very similar background to Lavanya's in terms of how I got into this field, and a lot of gratitude goes to the cartoons we used to see as kids, and they would definitely kind of expand our sense of wonder. And then I think during my, I don't remember whether it was my 11th or 12th when the rage was all about sitting for IIT coaching. And I remember sitting in those coaching classes and there used to be physics or chemistry or something going on. And I used to be sitting on the last bench plotting my fan fiction for the 7th book of Harry Potter. And yeah, there was no turning back from there. I knew that my future was not in IIT or anything of that sort. And as Lavanya rightly said, like, we all grew up reading a very limited set of fantasy and science fiction initially that came to us from the West. But right now we're all very privileged to read so much more and open our eyes to many different cultures. And I'm very grateful to be a part of that.
Okay, yeah, quite similar, but it all started for me with Doordarshan, watching Space City Sigma, right? I don't know how many of you remember it. There's this thing called Space City Sigma that we later figured out was a blatant Star Trek ripoff. Right? This is Doordarshan in the 80s. You had just one channel and you had no other option. Right? And then you had Captain Vyom and you had these little ray guns, right? Milind Soman in his first starring role, ray guns and all kinds of aliens. And you're like, wow, right? Something like this exists. Otherwise, till then you were just sitting watching Ramayana, right? And then you grew up a little and then then at that point in time, I grew up in towns like Gulbarga and Karwar, where you don't have like big bookstores, but Navakarnataka used to have this annual exhibition, and there was a little Jaiko abridged classics. And then you read H.G. Wells, and then you read Jules Verne, and they're like, wow, right? Again, aliens and all this sort of thing. And it was only much later you figured out, okay, these kind of stories are called science fiction, right? And all, okay, if it's got dragons and all, that's called fantasy. So that's something stayed with me. I went looking for more books, and then when I was given an opportunity to write for Factor Daily, I like, you know what they say, right? Those who can't write about it. Right? I don't have the discipline to be a writer. So I thought, okay, if everybody writes, who's going to read? So I'd rather be out there talking to people, writing about the books worth reading and all of that. And what's given me most joy in that part of my columnist part of my life, more than the reader part of my life, is that now I'm writing about books in which people are named Kumar, right? Or Prashanth, right? And not just a John Smith. I've never met a John Smith in my life, right? So it just felt that much more rewarding and so happy, and that's where we are now.
Happy to know that there was a Doordarshan ripoff of Star Trek. I'm going to immediately go back home and YouTube this. But similarly, I think a lot of us were raised on, as you said, Tolkien, Dune, H.G. Wells.
No, see, that was the syllabus. That was practically the syllabus for anyone wanting to read science fiction in India. Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, some Ursula Le Guin, right? And then when it came to fantasy, you had Robert Jordan, you had Tolkien. This is more or less where it stopped. I mean, once in a way you'd have a Van Vogt. I mean, till the second-hand bookstores came along and they started buying stuff by the containers, and we got some Van Voigts and all of those things second-hand. Till then, this was syllabus.
Yeah, and actually to add to what you're saying, Shenoy, at that time, the definition of this is science fiction and this is fantasy and this is magical realism and so on and so forth did not exist in our consciousness. So you would just read across genres without actually creating those divisions in your mind. And, when you would encounter things that were far beyond the realms of the real and the possible, for that would appeal to me. But, it was syllabus, but again, we didn't consciously consume it as part of syllabus. It was when you go searching for stuff that has dragons or stuff that has spaceships, right? These are the books you'd find.
Yeah, because these are the only books available
Exactly.
in India,
Exactly.
right? Which supposedly doesn't have SF readership. I say supposedly, right? So this is what you read.
And something I think that all these books and authors had in common was the real appreciation for world building and very obviously diverse world building as well. So what elements of world building appeal the most to you? Like those, what are the things you go looking for?
Uh, for me, when I started, reading fantasy, I used to read lot more fantasy than science fiction. I did not follow a syllabus. So for me, I was very fascinated by the maps that were on page one. You know, when you open and you saw one brand new map that did not look like the map of India or the world, I was like, wow, where is this river flowing? Right? So that's where it started for me, and I was very intrigued by world building. And when I even started writing, I would spend weeks and months just sitting and sketching a map, trying to get things right. And it went into a rabbit hole, multiple rabbit holes, in fact. And that became a very important, or rather, a very naive but important part of my initial writing. And, and right now, as I have started writing more and more, I've realized there are more aspects to world building, obviously, than just drawing a map. There are social aspects, there are cultural aspects, political aspects. I think put together, what really fascinates me is building a culture from scratch. Like, you have the freedom to set right certain wrongs that are there right now. You have that freedom right now as an author, and you have the freedom to imagine religions. You have the freedom to imagine faiths in a way that you feel will respect more people than the current reality does, right? So I think that's something that really fascinates me, and yeah, that's where I go from there.
Before we knew all the cool terms to describe these things, it was just seeing something that didn't exist in the world, that part of world building is what appealed to me. Like, we watched Star Trek, right? It is nice to see them explore different planets, different culture, and and extrapolate it to everything else, right? Or you look at Star Wars, for that matter. The world that it's immersed in. I mean, I think Jedis are like the fourth most followed religion in the UK right now, right? As per the census, right? So, I mean, just shows you the impact that some fantastic world building can have on real life, and how they both feed off each other. That's something about world building that I've always found fascinating, right? I mean, completely new worlds. Some bits are familiar, some bits are not familiar, but then it comes out as something totally new. Like, more like the whole is more than the sum of its parts.
What both of what we are saying, right? Like what both of you are saying, rather, that resonates so strongly with me, because the ability to imagine cultures and make them feel real, where they can operate as metaphor, and I can see a mirror of the culture I belong to, either as a reflection, or I can see it as what it is not. That is what is truly beautiful to me. So someone who was very foundational to me as inspiration is Ursula Le Guin, whom Shenoy mentioned, and I'm sure we've all read. And she has this uncanny, phenomenal ability to write about other worlds, other planets, dragons and wizards in a way that feels like it is happening in my own backyard. Not because it's comforting and cozy and warm, but because the metaphors that I can identify with as a system of the world we know are so strongly reflected in there that they're immediately relatable. So I love the idea of culture that holds fundamental truths about our reality in it.
I think also what you said about building communities and righting wrongs, what do you personally feel resonates with you in that sense? Obviously, a lot of these worlds that we've created are parallel or sort of run parallel to our own. I mean, of course, we sort of exist in this reality. But what really strikes you and is something that you want to explore more?
So my approach to this, honestly, and this has been my approach in analog virtual as well. It is to reflect a very strong belief system, often that people think will save the world. And to take it to its extreme and point out that no single solution that we believe is perfect is actually infallible, and to kind of poke holes into it. So I actually enjoy taking something like, an ideal solution, right? So in analog virtual, it is imagine a world where everything is determined on the basis of merit. And those who deserve things get opportunities and privileges and technology. Because a lot of the time, this is suggested as the solution to a fragmented reality and the reality we occupy today. And it is a complete myth. And what I wanted to do through analog virtual was not necessarily err on the side of the didactic, but by spelling things out and saying this is bad, this is wrong, but actually show how something that is so blinkered in its philosophy could go horrifically wrong. And that is my approach to it. I like to take the system, build an ideal world, and then say, this is ideal for some people. And even the people for whom it is ideal struggle under its umbrella, because there is no such thing as the perfect, unifying, ultimate solution.
Yeah, I think I've explored something similarly when I was writing the Spice Gate, and in that world is something that's obsessed with spices. It runs on spices and it thrives on spices, and I wanted to project a world that appeared equitable, that appeared to be like very utopian, but had an undercurrent of tension that could snap at any moment. And that tension was carried by a group of people whose struggles were being completely ignored because everything else appeared rosy. I don't know how many of you read, the Ursula Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It deals with a similar concept. So yeah, when it comes to how we imagine world building, I think we all could take a leaf out of Ursula Le Guin's book, because what she does is she doesn't take just an individual's conflict, right? The conflict is between people and everything else around them, including your nature, your ecology, your planet, everything else. And I think that is the kind of world building that we must all aspire to, because it's important to consider that, especially as we write more and more science fiction, especially as we try to imagine more and more cities and kingdoms of whatever in the future. So yeah, yeah.
I don't do world building. I write about the worlds they build.
What are your thoughts on the world buildings that you have read about?
Okay, that we can go on. Right, but to pick up from what they both said, it's very, what I take sometimes exception to is like reducing everything to a utopia or a dystopia. Right, the question to ask is, like for example, if you take cyberpunk, right, and your book is cyberpunk, right? Oh, it's a dystopian city, whatever. Who is it a dystopia for? Right? Oh, this is a utopian version. Who is it a utopia for? Right? So there's always a utopia in every dystopia, and there's a dystopia in every utopia. Right? Beneath, if you see, movies like Minority Report and all of that, you see all this nice steel and chrome and big glass building and all this sort of a thing. You don't see two things in those cities. One thing is you don't see any green, and you don't see the behind the scenes people who are keeping that, that sheen going. Right? So for me, that's what I look for, when I'm reading a new book or whatever. So as much as it transports you into another world and you engage with, if it's fantasy, you engage with its magic systems and, its resources and its culture, or if it's fantasy, okay, what are the technologies they're depositing? What are these societal changes they're depositing? It's also about, okay, what are they not telling you? Right? What are they not telling you? That to me is a very fascinating aspect of world building.
And I think that leads me to the next thing I wanted to discuss is, in general, there's always a kind of line between the haves and the have-nots in anything. And there's a sort of sense, I feel like it's a theme in a lot of fantasy and sci-fi of dissent and conformity, and how everything always looks very beautiful at first glance, and then underneath there's so many cracks or faults in the making. So what aspects or themes are you interested in? What is there something that you in particular feel should be focused on more?
Never so quote unquote objective as in analog virtual. Objective and measurable.
Measurable.
Isn't that what science wants?
Absolutely. It wants algorithms. It wants to be able to put you on a curve and interpret you through data, and preferably give you a reality where you are a little plot point on a graph. That's exactly what happens in analog virtual. Things that I enjoy looking into is this, right? The reduction of the human experience to something that is predictable, something that can be manipulated, something where capitalism then can come in and kind of shape your wants, your dreams, your ideals for you. That's something I talk about a lot in analog virtual, and it recurs in a lot of my work, my other short fiction, and in my next book. And in the next one, it's about, cultural colonization, right? So how does culture then, from a dominant hegemonic point of view, tell you who you should aspire to be and what your values should be? So that's something that really interests me. I'm also very interested in, writing about this through the eyes of women protagonists. I feel that especially when you examine the relationship of women to technology, in the present world particularly, which is where technology is a tremendously male-dominated space, just the fact that in analog virtual, a lot of my characters are women, I want them to occupy that space because I have been a woman working in technology. And I know the perspective that I can bring to technology that a lot of men might not be able to bring. And similarly, right, to be as inclusive as possible and to see how a certain world with its parameters can really impact people who are not necessarily the people for whom the world is designed, whose utopia is it anyway, as Shenoy said. So even if you look around our cities and the way they are designed today, our public spaces are designed to be occupied by men, which is, something that I find deeply distressing. And I like to project this to the extreme in the future and, see where it can go.
Design cities and genres or whatever. If I would ever write, I would probably want to write a story about Bangalore with good roads, good transportation, accessible, public spaces. It will be called an urban fantasy.
I was just going to say, you're really projecting the fantasy.
There has to be a catch somewhere.
Yes. There will be an Aadhaar somewhere there.
Hello. Yeah. So for me, two key themes that I really like exploring every now and then. One is social justice, and the other is environmental justice. And in terms of environment, I try to explore that through some of my short stories. I try to imagine or rather envision a future which is a very plausible projection of where we are right now, where we will be forced to abandon what we have, right? But there will be a scenario where we will be brought back. And what do we find? Do we find a place for us? That is one aspect that I always wanted to explore, and I have explored in some of my short stories. And the other thing, very similar to within environmental justice itself, we have been denied a home in the future. And when we find a new home, what do we carry over from here? Do we carry over all our prejudices, all our biases, all our issues and ills? Or do we start anew and everything from a belief system to everything changes? So that kind of a thought experiment was something that always fascinated me in terms of like, how do I imagine a future where when your home changes, when your planet changes, what else does it change? What else does change? How much does human nature change when you go to a place where you are not, or you're not welcome, or maybe you kind of forced your way into, and how does it test you? So environmental justice was that way, was one of the concepts or themes rather that I always wanted to explore. The other being social justice is, we clearly see all around us, centuries and centuries of oppression of different classes and castes of people. And I would like to, within my knowledge and experience, try to give them some justice of, for those kind of oppression that they have suffered over the years and decades. So the Spice Gate actually deals with that a lot.
And I think that's something that's quite common in sci-fi and in fantasy, is a bit of subversivism, right? Like it is exploring things that we possibly don't see in real life, things that we think are a little out of our reach. So it's a wonderful way for authors and readers also to kind of imagine a world where certain injustices are corrected, or like you said, okay, we have to abandon ship, but what happens when we come back, as you said. As Indian writers and readers, what do you think are things that we should focus on uniquely? Because obviously the experience now is, as contemporary Indians, we're expecting something different from our reading than the ones that we did, that we saw when we were children or we grew up with. So is there anything that you feel should be covered more?
So I think it is possible to bring in something that's uniquely contextually Indian without playing to the trope of what it means to be Indian. I have very strong opinions about this, but I genuinely do feel that there is a Western narrative about that dominates what being Indian means and what Indian subjects are, or what Indian people can write about. It is almost like a limit saying, you come from India. There are some very hard realities about India, and I'm not saying they don't exist, and I'm not saying that it isn't important to reflect them. Our wealth disparity, our social injustices, our oppression of people from various walks of life, be it on the basis of caste, class, gender. There is a lot of stuff there that is very important to write about. But can Indian science fiction only exist if it deals with the important things, is a thought that I frequently, grapple with and think about. Because why can't a work of Indian science fiction be considered Indian enough if it is simply a flight of fancy? Sheer escapism, set somewhere influenced by India. Maybe the characters have Indian names. It just so happens that these Indians are in space. And, there's Star Wars with Indian characters, right? Without necessarily being Slumdog Millionaire Star Wars set in space. And for me, that's where I stand on this, because I feel like, yes, there is a lot of social commentary that can come through, but at the same time, we are also capable of being entertainers. We are also capable of writing escapism. And all of this should count as Indian. And that's where I stand on this.
I mean, see, like she said, the narrative is so driven by the US, UK market and all that. It's not just an Indian thing or a South Asian thing. I mean, even Sri Lankan writers grapple with this. Even the Pakistani writers grapple with this. Right? Even the writers from Bangladesh grapple with it. Somehow, the expectation is that you will only write science fiction or fantasy that reflects your culture. Right? Why is the burden only on Indian or non-Western writers? I mean, if the Western English writers from the US have the freedom to create a Trantor or whatever, which does not reflect any of their cultures, Indian authors should also be given the same freedom. Right? But that said, all good stories are universal, right? Now, to take the example of Lavanya, since she's right here, Analog Virtual is set in the Bangalore of the future. It's been rebranded as Arcx City. I crossed, Mint Square. I crossed Mint Square to come. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see why the Mint Square is important, right? But there was a certain Indianness to it, but it was very universal. I mean, the Apex City could have been Los Angeles, right? So this is what I keep hearing. Either it's too Indian or it's not Indian enough. I mean, who decides? And which India are you talking about? This India with the capital I that everyone is talking about, it doesn't exist. India is multitudes. I mean, you go 50 kilometers in this direction, language changes, food changes. You go 100 kilometers in this direction, clothing, festivals, rituals, language changes. So, I think we should also sort of, in that sense, decolonize our minds in terms of there being this one India narrative or this one idea of India. And this expectation as a reader saying that, okay, if this isn't an India that I'm familiar with, it's not Indian enough. Or I wouldn't call it Indian. Right? I mean, look at the mirror and look at your own ignorance type is what I tell these people. Because like she does, I too have strong opinions about this. But yeah, I'll stop at that.
No, it's definitely a systemic thing, It's not just what we write, it's like what readers are expecting, what publishers are expecting. It's going to take a lot of effort, but yeah, we can write escapism. We can all tell a good story. I shouldn't be burdened to always write about social justice and environmental justice. Sure, I mean, it's something that I want to bring out into the world, but I want to tell a good story primarily. And if my social justice is coming in the form of a huge ass space opera somewhere, in the far future, I would want the entire system to be supportive of that. So yeah, that's where we all hope that Indian science fiction and fantasy kind of is or will become in the next few years. More and more writers writing what they like rather than what is expected of them.
Yeah, I mean, because you see Lavanya's book or you see Gautam Bhatia's books or Yudhanjay Vijayratne's book, they can go head to head with any novel being published in the West, right? And I would rather that all of these writers write the stories that they want to tell, rather than wanting to meet some, this sort of, diversity quota, which is a box to be ticked for publishers. I mean, there are lots of people occupying that space already who are not Indian, or rather they're only Indian when it comes to marketing their books. But I'm glad to see the direction that this is going in, where the Lavanyas, the Prashanth, the Samit Basus, the Gautam Bhatias, and the Yudhanjay Vijayratnes are writing stories that they want to say. It's, it has a strain of Indianness, or it has that Sri Lankan strain in it, right? But it could be anywhere else. They're telling stories that they want to say without wanting to, fit into some quota. And I'm happy the place that is in. I mean, things could get a lot better for sure, but I'm very glad of the place that South Asian SF is in right now, and because everybody's doing it on their own terms.
Oh, thank you for saying the nice things about my book. And, I am also grateful, and I see this change coming about, right, where Prashanth's book is entirely in a secondary world. There are concerns that reflect concerns in India, but you cannot immediately, directly, say India, right? Like I'm guessing, I haven't read it, but from what I've heard about it, it's a secondary. I can't wait to read it either.
That's huge monsters.
There we go, right? Yeah. That's fantastic. And like Shenoy mentioned, there's Sumit's work, everything from secondary fantasy worlds that read like Terry Pratchett. And here's what's great to me about that, right? Indians can be funny. We can be funny. We don't have to just pontificate about all the important like things in the world and how, I don't know how much injustice there is. We can also have a sense of humor. It should be permitted. From superheroes to Pratchett, right? That's what he's writing. Gotham writing beautiful poetry, lyrical style prose in The Wall and the Horizon. There are so many dimensions to our self expression and to what the limits of that should be. In fact, it should be limitless. And like Prashanth said, the burden of always having to go and say, here is my culture and look at it, and inevitably look how oppressive it is. Because, an oppression narrative is a really marketable thing. And just being able to write, and I'm not saying oppression is not important to talk about again, right? But can it be done with subtlety? Can it be done with without necessarily setting it in India, right? Can that same narrative happen in space, in the Spicegate world, in Sumer, in Apex City? There are so many places it can happen.
So I know we've been throwing a lot of names around, right? A lot of unfamiliar names. So I'll just name the books that you can read, right? So what she said about being funny and superheroes that Samit's writing. So the trilogy is called the Game World trilogy. The first is Simoquin Prophecies by Samit Basu, which was the first fantasy novel in English. In English, because Indian languages there were many others. It's funny as hell. It's funny as hell, right? The blurb itself says, Tolkien meets Pratchett, right? The superhero book is called Turbulence. It's again by Samit Basu, and it's wonderful. So there's this bunch of people who get onto a flight in London, and when it lands in Bombay, they've undergone turbulence. Something has happened, and all the passengers have superpowers. And I absolutely love one line in that book. It said, "Superman is real. He was Indian." Yeah, that's from Turbulence. I mean, it's followed up by a book called Resistance, which is, so it makes it a duology. It's nice to read. There's like big blockbuster action sequences, superheroes going against each other, right? There's this woman, and everybody seems to have gotten a superpower based on their greatest fears or desires and all of that. So there's this woman who can sort of be in many places at the same time because she was not allowed to go to college or work. She always wanted to explore other parts of herself. So her superpower is that she can replicate, herself, have 3-4 instances of her running at the same time. It's brilliantly thought out. It's brilliantly thought out. So just go read it. I mean, it's nice to sit and talk about it, but it'll only go somewhere if you guys go there, get the books and read it.
Oh, and to add to this, right, to just show the spectrum of what Indian science fiction and fantasy is doing, Indra Das is The Devourers.
Yes.
You've got werewolves.
It's got werewolves.
Indian werewolves. I mean, not necessarily Indian. Well, Indian.
Indian werewolves.
Werewolves running around Calcutta, right? And there is an entire justification for how that has happened. So it's very plausible. But the powerful thing in that book that really speaks to me is, why can't we write about werewolves and dragons and vampires? Just because they have origins that are in a different geography, are they off limits to us? Because we've seen writers ad nauseum write about Indian epics and Indian culture, everyone from Zelazny to, Neil Gaiman writing about Indian mythological figures. So where's my capacity to write about dragons? I want to write a dragon book,
and
right?
Speaking of werewolves and vampires, there's this fabulous comic called These Savage Shores. Okay, it's by Ram V, who also happens to be the first Indian writer to have written a Batman comic for DC, right? And the premise is very nice. So there's this colony ship coming from the west to India, and it's got vampires and all that sort of thing, who think like we are on top of this supernatural creature world. We're like the alpha males of the monster world, And then they come and land in Kerala, right? In a land which has enough supernatural creatures of its own, right? And I loved the way it was done. It's called These Savage Shores, in case anybody's taking down notes.
Prashanth, give us a sneak peek of the monsters in Spicegate.
I don't know. I mean, like they're very scary. They're huge, and they're meant to kind of protect this land that has been believed to be inhospitable, and they're supposed to be like the guardians of that place, right? And this protagonist has to kind of navigate through that land. It sounds like a very nice hero's journey. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, I hope you guys will like it.
Sure, I will. I mean, you said monsters 3 times already.
And some of them are
And
flying.
and you said spices, which means there's biryani.
Yes.
Right. So of course I'll like it.
There's a nice section of at the end of the novel where the protagonist and his family are like just cooking like a big pot of biryani to have at the end. And I'm not joking. That happens.
Okay, I'll buy 2 copies then.
It gives me great joy that there's biryani in your book. I mean, I was already going to pre-order, but Uh, sorry, Monsters and Biryani is a great title for something if anyone wants it. Also, I was wondering more in terms of, say, language, and in terms of just your style of writing and the books that we're reading now from contemporary Indian authors. I feel like when we were younger, we read a lot of epics because that was kind of what we had access to. That was the sci-fi and fantasy that was in the library or, at bookstores, as we mentioned earlier. And now contemporary writers are a lot crisper, we have access to the idea of a trilogy, duology, etc. How do you think your writing style has evolved in comparison to things like that you read growing up?
I think there is certainly some influence that gets carried over a period of time from where we started to where we are, and there's always a bit of every book that you read that seeps into your writing. But I also like to believe that we all do carry our individual styles, and like I know that when I read Samsara in a Teacup, one of the short stories that Lavanya wrote, and I could tell that this was Lavanya's style of writing after I read Analog Virtual. So we all do carry that essence of ourselves. It's not necessarily Indian, it's just us, right? We try to, sometimes consciously or subconsciously, we do incorporate our languages that we speak on a day-to-day basis into it. And this is something that, has been bothering me, or rather, it's an intriguing topic of discussion where, editors, especially in the West, they want to italicize Indian words. I don't do that. I say, no, that needs to be, remove your control IO from your hand, from the keyboard. That needs to be normal. I don't want to italicize an Indian word over there unless there is a particular emphasis on that word or phrase, right? Because that again is I don't know. It's not the kind of treatment of language or culture that we want to take forward once, So yeah, that's a topic of discussion, and I believe there are different schools of thought for that. So, but yeah, this is where I come from.
Yeah, I share where Prashanth comes from. And likewise, when I read Prashanth's short fiction, there is something like a unique identifying style, right? And this is, you can see hints of influence, but then you can see also the uniqueness and the development of a very singular voice. I think something that we share, and a lot of the writers we mentioned also share, is the comfort with which we just decide to bring in Indian words. And by Indian words, I mean from all the Indian languages, right? So I'm very comfortable with Tamil and Kannada. And so a lot of my work will have Tamil and Kannada words there without an explanation for them, because why should I explain it? And similarly, with Samit's work, with Indra's work, with Gautam's work, you will see an entire concept in an Indian word without necessarily the italicization, without necessarily, a little asterisk and a footnote saying, in this language, this means. And that is something growing up I saw in a lot of books. A lot of very successful popular books, critically acclaimed books written by Indians or people who were not white Anglo-Saxon, explaining cultural concepts. And I think we are slowly but positively moving into a world where there are pockets where the approach is, if people really want to know what this is, Google it, right? It's possible to Google it. And I embrace that because I feel like where Prashanth was coming from, kind of creating a pecking order even within the gamut of a single work of fiction where you immediately say that English is the acceptable language and everything else is, the exception. When you don't have to draw attention to it, when those words in a regional language are part of the natural flow of the prose, I don't like that, and I'm here for a world where it no longer happens.
Yeah, and see, this is very, very obvious. It's, I think, also because of the nature of the language itself. English, lingua franca of the world, and all that sort of thing. You wouldn't find this issue if you're reading science fiction in our Indian languages, right? So I can read Hindi, I can read Kannada, so I read in that. This doesn't come out at all. It's that it is just so rooted in the culture. It's very close. All the cultural nuances come out. There's no, you're writing in Kannada, you don't have to explain what this word is in which language and all of those things. So it's a very SF in English thing, right? But it's a function of the language you choose to write in and nothing else.
Also, it's not just the choice of words and the usage of specific words, it's also the way people speak. Because in India or in any culture that is across the world, actually, even in so-called native English-speaking cultures, you go from one region to the other, slang changes. The way sentences are constructed change. And it is nice to see books in which that is being reflected from all parts of the world, whether it's Southeast Asia or South Asia, and even the UK and the United States, depending on who the speaker is, the manner in which language is used changes. And I think that should be normalized.
Absolutely. And I think something interesting that I've seen in a lot of more contemporary writers, as you said, is the lack of using italics, because we definitely fight over the Google Doc when it comes to this. So I'm glad to hear that. And with more and more new voices being published, really, I think that there's a lot of touching on topics which are kind of taboo and still are taboo. So, for example, in your book, you talk about, abortion, pregnancy, and just general technological misogyny and things like that. What are things that you'd like to see discussed more with more nuance, I suppose, rather than, as you said, kind of force-feeding the audience?
I'm all here for inclusivity on the basis of gender and sexuality. I think we have come a long way, but we can go a long way with more queer voices, more women's voices. I think that's really important. I think that's underrepresented, and it is nice that, we are actually in a space where if you look at the West, you will actually see queer SFF as its own like sub-genre in that sense. And I encourage that, and I think there can be more. I also think, climate change, but having said that, I do see climate change inevitably creeping into everybody's work, right? Because when you build a world, even if you are not consciously writing a climate change novel, you can't describe people's clothes without figuring out what the weather is. And if this is the weather, what's causing the weather? And if this is what's causing the weather, what's the impact on the crops, right? And what kind of world really is it? And I think, for me, something that I'm fascinated by, that I want to explore, is sort of cultural dominance, cultural hegemony, the impact that has on people and their behaviors, without necessarily, again, putting it into an extreme. Here is an empire, these are people in power, here are the oppressed, and they are subservient. That is a dynamic we've seen over and over again. But take away empire, now what happens, right? Everyone feels equal. Are they really equal? Those are the types of things that really interest me.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this breaking down of the empire, and I don't know how many of you have watched this new TV show that's going around, Andor. And like we've all grown up on a lot of us have grown up on Star Wars, and we know that there's this big bad empire, right? Right, evil dark lords, and there are lightsabers, and there are crazy battles and everything. But to make that empire, there is an army of bureaucrats that kind of from the ground up run the back show, right? It's if there's a spaceship that's just flying in space, we can see the big bad villain standing by the glass window over there, brooding. But there are 1,000 other people, each with their own personalities, each with their own loyalties, and that kind of nuance is something that is slowly coming into different narratives. And this is just an example that I'm showing, but I believe that even when we are talking about black and white narratives, like in a Star Wars narrative, there is so much nuance that can be explored, because that's a great opportunity to also bring in culture, right? Because Star Wars, as an example, is like an amalgamation of so many cultures across the galaxy, right? And when we talk about an empire or an imperial system that comprises so many countries, so many planets, so many different cultures and languages and aliens, it's an opportunity as a content creator, right? Whether you're making a movie or you're writing a book, to go into the depths of each of those cultures. And we as writers definitely should be exploring that more and more.
Two things that I would like to see. One is more hopeful futures, right? Okay, inequalities, it needs to come in, but there are ways, I'm sure, that we can talk about it in hopeful tones, right? I would like to see stories of better India, of a hopeful future, right? I'm not saying sweep it all under the carpet or just ignore it or be an ostrich, but I'm sure there's a world you can build in which these things have changed and we've reached a better place. That's one thing that I would like to see. The other thing that I would like to see is visions of alternate Indias, right? Because alternate history India's not been treated too much in alternate history, right? So that little branching of point, that little what if this had happened, right? I mean, I would like to see someone do in India like what Vijay Ratne, Yudhanjay Vijay Ratne did with his, Commonwealth trilogy, where, India has not yet become independent, and the China is still under monarchy. There are robots going around, the Queen's tin soldiers. The Sri Lanka still has the royal houses still functional way into the future. And what happens? I mean, it's steampunk. It's future Sri Lanka, but at the same time, it's an alternate Sri Lanka. Right. So these are the two things that I would like to, as a reader, like to read more of. Alternate Indias and hopeful futures.
That's a great point, because I now that you've mentioned it, haven't actually read much about alternate Indias and haven't really.
There's this one stray story by Jayant Narlikar, in which the Marathas win the Battle of Panipat and all of that, and how does India and the world change in its aftermath. But otherwise, India's just been one setting or a backdrop in other alternate histories. Like, for example, in Kim Stanley Robinson's Year of Rice and Salt, for example, the premise there is, what if the Black Plague had wiped out 96% of the European population? So then they wouldn't have colonized and all that. And in that book, there is the enlightened state of Travancore, which is like a proper superpower. Travancore is still ruled by the royal family, and they have this great technology and all of those, and they're like major players on the world stage. So it exists, but not in stories written by Indians. I want to see how Indians would, do this.
And to your point also, Prashanth, when you were talking about perhaps the feeling ineffectual and the different the different perspectives of people who make up an empire or whatever. I was actually thinking about Samit, who we've referenced way too much, and shout out to Samit, his recent book, Chosen Spirits. And one of the things when I spoke to Samit about that book was he mentioned that he wanted to write about characters who knew that they couldn't save the world. And I thought that was, first of all, extremely interesting because we're all a little bit raised on the chosen one perspective, right? Like we're all waiting for our Anakin Skywalker or our Luke Skywalker. And now we're thinking more in terms of, okay, yes, things are going wrong and one person is not going to be the pebble that stops the avalanche. And I think that's a very interesting perspective and one that I'm seeing more of now. Right? Are there any other things that you would like to see more of in terms of, you mentioned gender, sexuality, things like that. And I find that's something that's coming out more now with writers in forget India, but in general. And Prashanth mentioned fan fiction, which frankly, I think launched 1,000 careers. But are there any things like that you would like to do more of exploring yourself or like?
Not myself, but I would like to see more and more writers explore environments outside our Indian epics. Like, I feel we might be reaching a saturation there. There are just way too many stories derived from the Mahabharata and Ramayana. I'm not saying don't write those stories. There are stories which explore some amazing moral compasses across the spectrum of all these stories, and they are great stories. But there is, I believe, that in creating imagined worlds, right, in exploring the possibility of imagined worlds, there's just so much potential that Indian writers can bring. And that is something that I want more and more writers to do, including myself. And like that's one reason why I did not step into my Indian mythology. I wanted to create worlds from scratch and see how I can bring my experiences from my childhood, which includes growing up on Mahabharata and Ramayana, into these brand new worlds, and how I can incorporate my learnings and my experiences, the prejudices that I've experienced, prejudices that other people have experienced, into those kind of worlds. And I think the more writers do that, I believe that the more, coming back to his initial point of how Indian writing should not be defined by just, what is Indian or too much Indian. That's where we can really come out in volumes, because there are tons of writers writing mythology. Imagine if all of those people start creating their own imaginary worlds right now, right? The potential is really staggering, and it's an opportunity.
That's an interesting point, because also I feel that there has been a real resurgence in the last couple of years of alternate mythologies in terms of like, I'm reimagining the journey of Shiva, or I'm reimagining the Greek gods. Or, it's a trend that we've seen in the last couple of years. And as you said, probably reached saturation point of seeing the Mahabharata in space or whatever.
There are, see, I mean, when the most of the ones that we see are those templatized covers, no? Right? There's this, it's like, after Da Vinci Code, there's this whole industry, right, about hidden conflicts. They all follow the same cover template. Same is happening with, I call it mythsploitation, right? So I will imagine Shiva, okay, I will now tell you the story of Ravana, this, that, and stuff like that, right? But not all of them are bad. There are good ways of doing it too. Just I mean, like Cersei, right, this thing, but Kavita Kane or Anuja Chandramouli have been doing it for a long time. I mean, one thing is, the other thing I wish my fellow readers would also do is get over this thing of, Ghar ki murgi dal barabar, right? Anyway, to say about how myths can be done well in speculative words, for example, there's this anthology called Breaking the Bow, right? It's edited by Vandana Singh and Anil Menon, and it's the stories, predominantly they're all Indians, but there are also foreigners, like Lavi Tidar is there and his story begins with this immortal lines that Brahma said, "Let us defag." Right? So there, one writer has imagined Rama, Sita, and Ravana as AIs. Right? One story is written from the point of view of Shurpanaka in the age of reality TV, for example. Right? So there are nice ways of doing it. Or for example, there's this anthology called Magical Women, right? Edited by Sukanya Venkatraghavan, and it's an all women anthology. All the writers in that anthology are women, and it's full of angry goddesses. I mean, for the most part, there's a lot of angry goddesses in that. The way you would not expect goddesses to be angry in, right? There's a very nice story of how Savitri and Yama, and it's very queer, right? So there are ways of doing it well. I mean, you can't just brush them all. It's just that not enough people perhaps know of it, and they're not marketed well, or not enough people speak about it. So it's natural to feel that they don't exist, but they're there if you do go looking. And these two anthologies I recommend to everyone I meet, the Magical Women anthology as well as Breaking the Bow anthology. And you can see how mythological characters can be sort of recontextualized, relooked at, put in speculative words, and done well.
Yeah, to chime in, right? These are two examples where it's done phenomenally well. And what I enjoy about this, we have a huge tradition of mythology, right? And epics that are very familiar to us as you grow up in India, especially. But all the things that exist in those epics, not all of them are relevant to the world today. They deserve to be critiqued. They need to be critiqued. They need to be questioned.
Which is why I said the good ones, recontextualize them.
Exactly.
They recontextualize them. They contemporize them. See, our mythology has never been static.
Yeah.
Like if you read that paper, A.K. Ramanujan paper, 3,000 Ramayanas. There are 3,000 versions of Ramayanas that we know of. Right? So our myths have never been static. They've always been open to interpretation, to retellings, but recontextualization is where you take that little leap.
Absolutely. I'm all for breaking away from the notion that there needs to be a monomyth, right? There is only one acceptable, correct version of this narrative, and it is this. And any time that mold is broken out of, it's tremendously enjoyable.
And I think also that there's a not new, but also a kind of wave of people creating new myths and new ideas that we're kind of putting across. And hopefully in like, say, 20 years, people are going to look at your stories and say, I'm going to build on that, or I'm going to, be inspired and influenced by that. Are there any particular Indian authors that you kind of look back at as being very influential to your writing now?
Like we mentioned over 100 times, but Samit, of course, to demonstrate so categorically that Indians can be funny and we can write Pratchett-esque universes, that is mind-blowing. I remember being a 13-year-old and wanting to write at that point, and sitting in the last bench in class with this little notebook, like writing my magnum opus. And until that point, every time I wrote fiction, people's names were Edmund and Lucy, right? Because that's what I grew up reading. And reading Samit let me know that people with names like mine, or names like Shenoy and Prashanth and Anjali, we can exist in these fantasy lands too. So Samit was definitely one. And I think Harun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie was a big influence when I was younger.
I mean, that's proper speculative, right? But it's literary because Salman Rushdie wrote it. Right? So that's always been the issue with Get. I mean, are you a SF writer or a writer of SF? Anybody else had written it, it would be fantasy. But Salman Rushdie wrote it, so it's literature.
Poor Salman Rushdie.
All of these labels, though, They are publisher applied. They're marketing
Yeah,
labels,
they're meaningless. I mean, if
they're
you read
meaningless.
some, you read Samuel R. Delany or any of those, that's literature as good as literature gets, right? With the added advantage of aliens and
And
new worlds.
and honestly, it's such chaos over here. There's this wonderful speculative book set in near future Bombay, The Black Dwarves of the Good Little Bay, came out a couple of years ago. Bombay has been kind of destroyed by rising sea levels, and there's this last bastion, which is this massive fortress. And it's about a bureaucrat in
Gotse.
yeah, exactly. A bureaucrat, trying to make things work in that society. And that book felt like science fiction, post-apocalyptic science fiction to me. On Amazon, it was tagged magical realism, right? So it's just like I would, if one is curious and wants to explore this genre, I would just say ignore publisher labels because they are just marketing tactics, always.
Convenient shelving at best.
Absolutely. And not in physical bookstores, because most physical bookstores, with a few notable exceptions in Bangalore, will inevitably file your science fiction fantasy under children's books. Have you noticed that? Because I have.
It always makes me feel like such a weirdo hanging out in the children's book section. Like,
Yeah, that's where I made the nicest finds. I mean, I've seen your book in the science fiction section as well as the Indian writing section.
for anyone looking for Lavanya's book, you know where to find it.
Outside. It's right here.
If you want a signed copy, you know how to get it. Anyway, well, I think we have to wrap up now, and I think we'll have a few questions from the audience as well. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, is there anything on the horizon that we should be looking for from all three of you? Any new projects you want to shout out?
Book coming out next year, so I can keep talking about that until it comes out. So yeah.
Prashanth's book, The Spice Gate, out fall next year. Fantasy, it's going to be amazing. So, everyone follow Prashanth and wait for him to announce his pre-order link because it'll totally be worth the wait. I've got The 10% Thief out in the UK and US next year. I'm also working on my next book, which is set in space, and I'm very excited to put Indians in space.
I, for one, am looking forward to them writing all their books and then me writing about them.
Great. Open the floor to any questions if anyone has any.
Hi, so this was most interesting, and I really enjoyed learning about all of the new stuff that's happening and old stuff that you referenced, and thank you. My question was about, while you ended with no labels, I'm actually bringing in another label, which is sort of that which hovers on the periphery of all of what you're talking about, which is slipstream, I guess, like Atwood, right? Which is the kind of stuff that I write. And that is very interestingly different because it's, it can go anywhere. But in that sense, space is not the frontier. It's society that's the frontier, right? So I just wondered if any of you had a comment on that. I mean, it's embedded in everything you've said, but still.
I think we definitely have, again, it's slipstream gets concealed in all the marketing, this thing, because I think the starting of the year, there was this wonderful book by K.L. Meera called Kabar.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think I would classify that as slipstream, though. I mean, you're the slipstream writer, so I'm guessing if you have another label for that, please correct me. But we do have a lot of books, in that genre, and which are coming up, and it's very interesting because it helps us to assess society very well, while bringing in a very speculative this thing, and it's very smart of publishers to classify it under literary fiction, because it brings in more people than it does fantasy and sci-fi right now.
Thank you, Salman.
That's what I would say as well, right? As long as you have clarity in your head about what you're writing, right, and where it belongs, whatever the publisher labels it, that is their best effort to find you an audience at that point. And I have learned to just let go of that, because that's marketing. I know what I'm writing and I know exactly what it is.
I mean, science fiction is gone a long way away from being about aliens and ray guns only, right? Like, for example, like Kim Stanley Robinson, one of my favorite sci-fi authors, said that if you want to write about the realism in our age, you have to write science fiction, right? So I wouldn't care too much about labels, right? Slipstream again was one of those labels that, you know, just sort of Bruce Sterling made up on the fly. Right, it's a cool name, right? It's just made up on the fly, right? But really, authors write what they write, and then readers like it or not. It's just that sci-fi was considered juvenile, which is why serious authors who didn't want to be called sci-fi and were shelved there. It's like, it's not fantasy, it's magic realism.
Aspect to the fact of, except for Ursula Le Guin, it was also a very male kind of viewpoint. I think that was the other thing that one, I think, fought against a little bit.
True. I mean, just look up this this great exchange of letters between Atwood and Le Guin, right? When Atwood said, "I'm not, science fiction is quiz in outer space, and I'm not writing science fiction." Right? Number one, that's one. And then Ursula Le Guin's rejoinder to Kazuo Ishiguro, right? I mean, in an interview, he said, I hope this will not be called a fantasy novel. Right? He said, I hope this won't be called a fantasy novel, because that means losing readers, right? And then Ursula Le Guin, ever the grand dame of spec fic, she had a nice little rejoinder to that. So it's all there on the net. If you just put Ursula Le Guin, Kazuo Ishiguro, or Ursula Le Guin, Margaret Atwood, you'll read up all about this, how these little genre things and these labels play out.
In fact, I'm so sorry. In fact, Le Guin was so pivotal to bridging this gap between the male-dominated viewpoint and what genre eventually became. She writes in a newer edition of Earthsea, she writes an introduction to it, and she talks about how she was a product of her times, and so her protagonist in Earthsea is a male wizard. And she says, I wrote 3 books, and then I thought, why is my protagonist male? And then she decided to spend her 4th book kind of going into what women in this male-dominated wizarding world were doing. And, I feel like she is that bridge over there, because she was raised in that culture of writing about male perspectives and realized I don't have to do this anymore. And I respect that tremendously. It's amazing.
I mean, speaking of labels, like there is a difference between a spy novel and novel with a spy in it. Right? When you go looking for a spy novel, there are certain things that you expect. A spy novel has certain tropes, right? And if those tropes exist in a book with the spy, and even if they're not calling it a spy novel, I will still call it a spy novel.
Thank you for that lovely discussion. This is my favorite question to ask science fiction fans and by extension writers, Star Wars or Star Trek. And on a more serious note, I just want to know, what comes first in your heads? Is it the plot, the character, or the political, the world that you would like to construct? And I would imagine this would be different because you're science fiction writers. Thank you.
For me, it's Star Trek. I believe it's more expansive. I enjoy the fact that their purpose is to engage with culture. And it's not necessarily all about power struggle with one tiny little family, which is also tremendously enjoyable. I'm not saying it isn't, but I enjoy the sort of the largeness of the Star Trek universe. I think for me, it differs from piece of fiction to piece of fiction. There are some times when the entire world pops into my head at once. And then I figure out what its parameters are and then see, okay, now who is the best kind of person to convey what I'm trying to say about this world. And at other points, it's the character, like someone I just know I have to tell their story. I know exactly where they're coming from. And sometimes it's a blend of both, where I kind of figure, I'm going to set this in space. And then immediately I think, oh, wouldn't a chef in space be awesome fun? Like, what would that chef in space be doing? And so I've got space, I've got a chef in space, and then I'm building things on the side. So that's how it works for me.
I'm a huge plotter. Like I want everything written down in crazy detail before I even like write down the first word. Even then, I kind of define my own notes sometimes, as it happens with every writer, I'm guessing. But yeah, I mean, it does vary from fiction to fiction. But like I like to, there is a theme or there is a scene or an image in the head that kind of pops up, which becomes an idea, which kind of goes and rests into a cocoon before it comes out bursting as a butterfly. So that's where it starts, and then you have ideas in your head as to how you reach there. And as she rightly said, like, who's the best person to bring it there? And that's why your character comes in. And after that, like, once you're in your character's head, it's all their journey. Wherever they take you, you just follow. You're a slave after that.
Yeah, I plot a lot too. And I've got all my notes, and then the character pops in and says, no, I'm not doing any of this, good luck.
Well, many ideas were covered. I was thinking the whole day about the title, Brave New Worlds. Many things came to my mind. Now I heard many things from all of you. But two people in the modern world made two statements which I want to refer here, and your opinion. Our new Chief Justice of India, Mr. Chandrachud, 2 days ago, gave an advice to the entire judiciary of our country. Please be free from the colonial mindset. It is his statement. A few days ago, I read another statement by the so-called richest man in the world, Elon Musk. He made a statement that future of the world, removal of poverty, you mentioned that, Removal of poverty depends on two factors: human robots and artificial intelligence. These two things together can remove poverty of the world. So I linked up all these together today. I was totally in confusion. What are your statements about these two great people's statements to the world for the brave new world?
I think with Elon Musk, right? He comes from a tremendously privileged position, and this is the problem with all technology that I have witnessed. Who is it designed for? What is it designed to do? A simple example: you take a smartphone, right? Recently, we had demonetization happen. Everybody was to move to digital currency and all of that. You take your basic smartphone and you put it in the hands of somebody who's never used a smartphone before. This happened when my house helper got her first smartphone. The number of pre-existing apps that are already downloaded into that phone, where you don't know what their privacy settings are and you don't know what they're doing there except consuming space, that is manipulative, and that is sitting there to prey on this person who needs this phone so that they can transact cashlessly. Right? It's a tiny example. But when you look at what happened with lockdown in India, there were a handful of us, a very privileged few, who could sit in our apartments in air conditioning, working from home for our tech companies or our jobs that allowed us to work off computers, while thousands of migrant workers had to struggle through the heat to return home. Right? So who gets access to this technology? It's wonderful to dream about the technology and to say, robots will change the world, right? And this will help eradicate poverty. But what concerns are those robots going to be built to address, right? What is the problem statement that this robot or this artificial intelligence system is going to come in and help with? And then who can use it? And whose inputs get to design it? Because the way technology is designed right now, for all of the benefits it brings, and it certainly brings benefits, it is top-down capitalist design. The end goal of people building technology, by and large, is profit. So who gets to build that tech? Who gets to decide this tech is going to be helpful for this person and improve their life? Is it the person themselves? Because if it happens grassroots up, then I see optimism in it. But if it's some company sitting in California saying this will end poverty in rural Karnataka, right? On what basis? And how are they determining that? And how are they going to implement that? It's a great dream to have. But my concern is that this is a very white technocrat dream from a person whose existence so far has been about attempting to gain profit, and so I'm on the fence. I would like to see a world without poverty in which technology can help. But who builds that tech is a very important question to me. And similarly with decolonizing our minds, I think, I think we have been working on that very actively. The fact that we can access so much more information, not just about the wider world, but about ourselves, right? And that this information feels legitimate. Reading Indian writers is legitimate. They are every bit as good as any other writer out there in the world, in any language, right? And likewise for writers from every culture. The fact that somebody writing in English can only be a good writer in English if they come from a so-called native English-speaking country. Decolonization lies in saying, no, that's not true. We can, anywhere in the world that you exist, whether you were a former colony or not, you have the power to dream. You have the power to share the future. The future does not have to be decided by our former colonizers. And that's where I stand on that. Again, it's a hard process. It's not an overnight thing because you have to unlearn a lot, including, certain values about how, and I'm a Shakespeare fan, but, how Shakespeare is the word when it comes to literature. How do you unlearn that and say, he is one of the words in English literature, right? There are so many more. It's a process, and I think it's an important process. Long answer.
Does that answer your question?
Does that add more thoughts? More confusing thoughts?
Sorry for throwing it back at you.
Well, honestly, I would say even if to avoid confusion in the future, stop taking Elon Musk seriously. 100%. Really, just because he's the richest man and we know how he got there, doesn't mean that everything that he says is right or has to be. As far as his statement of AI, it's a nice thing to say. He was the man who said, give me 6 billion, I will, solve world hunger. 6 billion. And he spent 44 billion on a whim to buy Twitter so that he can go viral. So I wouldn't take him seriously really, unless, like she touched upon, he says how and what, how it's going to happen, for who, and what he's going to do about it. I'm not going to take it seriously. Those are just empty words. It's just because it's Elon Musk and he says that everybody gives it, a lot of airplay. So
While like a lot of us need to decolonize our mindset, a lot of billionaires need to de-profit their mindsets. So there's the parallel journey that needs to happen to solve both our issues.
Chandraju said without changing the national anthem of India. That is the primary step we need to take that colonized us forever. We are carrying for 75 years. Bharata Bhagya Vitata. Why? Tell me.
Yeah, it's a very complex answer to give, and I believe there are things that we need to take from all our experiences as a country through colonizing. We have adopted a language, and we are successfully using it to further our. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, the language has colonized us. And should decolonizing include removal of English? I don't think so. So, right? So what does decolonizing, what will it involve? First and foremost, I think what we will need to do is kind of let go of some of our insecurities, stop chasing after things that we believe constantly make us proud. You know, we are a good country. We are a great country that we have come out of many experiences, many oppressions, and we stand tall in many fields. And I think we will continue to. So yeah, put things simply.
Thanks for a lovely evening. I think different points and lots of authors you've mentioned. I didn't note it down, but I'm going to Google it. My question was, when we speak, we do carry our own languages, especially when we speak in English. You know, you can kind of, you carry your mother tongue into it. But when we write, there is a lot of process of editing. So how much of leeway is there in when your book gets published? How much of a traditional or let's say conventional style of English is allowed, or do you have to really work on it to meet the publisher's, what do you say? I mean, does it need to be accepted in that way, or your language is it allowed in English writing? Because I know that in your own languages, let's say Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, you can get in your language easily. But with English, there is, especially with writing, oral is still, you do carry your language. But with writing, how much of your language does get carried into it? That's one. And the second one was just coming to we're talking about the richest, we're talking about, who's occupying these spaces. But I'm wondering with the Indian writers, who are the writers who are occupying that space? Where do they come from? The caste, the class? Is there a dominant space being occupied by a certain class and caste? And is there room for marginalized caste groups? Do you see voices there? I haven't read much in this space of the Indian writers, but I was curious to know if you all have some kind of response in that.
With regard to language, I think the most important thing is to be able to tell a fantastic story, and the language being a product of you and being unique to your voice, there are limits of acceptability based on what the context of what you're writing is, where it is set. I think it is very fluid, and it is not dominated by, correct me if my understanding is wrong, but we were all raised writing compositions in school that read extraordinarily formal. That is not how we speak. That is not how we express ourselves in writing anymore. It doesn't have to be there. It can be playful. It can be redefined. It can be contextualized. And I think that is perfectly, that is something that we've seen a lot of writers do. And so when you talk about formal English, don't think of it as like a straitjacket is what I would say. That straitjacket of 10th standard board exam composition, which was awful, personally for me as well, just because I didn't feel like my natural voice. I felt like I was performing a voice that was a very formal voice. It does not have to be that. In terms of writers writing sci-fi fantasy, I think accessibility has a lot to play with where these writers come from, right?
One of the reasons why I'm glad that this is happening is that it opens the doors for newer voices, for more marginal voices to sort of come out, right? which is why even though most of the writers currently writing in English come from privileged backgrounds or whatever, what they're doing is, in my opinion, sort of breaking down the walls and, sort of making it acceptable for, opening up the space for more people to come in. So I think a full answer to this will only come 3, 4, 5 years down the line. It's too early to call.
Yeah, it's
too
very
early to call, because honestly, South Asian SF becoming this big, where we've had 2, 3 novels of science fiction by an Indian writer come out, has been happening consistently only from the last 4, 5 years. Right? It was only in 2002 that the first fantasy novel in English was published. Right? And then there was a long winter, so to speak. Right? Before that, the English book that gained a lot of attention was in 92, when Amitav Ghosh's Calcutta Chromosome won the Arthur C. Clarke. Right? And then there was one stray book in the late 90s by Ruchir Joshi called The Last Jet Engine Laugh. Right? So this consistency has started more from the mid 2015s, where, Indra books came out, Samit's second book came out, and then Tashan Mehta's Liar's Weave came out, Prayag Akbar's Leela came out, her book came out, Samit's new book came out, right? It's a very recent phenomenon. It's a very recent phenomenon. And naturally it will tend to be that the people with access, that the people, urbanized people with privilege, will be there to sort of grab that opportunity. But what I'm happy with is that it's opening up the field for other people to come in, so that foreign publications now are more open to submissions from Indians, right? Be they queer writers or Dalit writers, right? I mean, the walls have been breached, but there's still work to be done, right? It's going to take 4, 5 more years till we can comment on it, because right now we don't have a big enough sample size.
Yeah, the dam has broken, right? And people with urban privilege are the people there who can make use of it right now, because it has been so recent.
One thing as a reader, as a columnist, as a critic, I've seen is that all of the writers who've come in, whether it is Indra or Samit or Lavanya or even Yudha or Gautam Bhatia, they are very encouraging of newer voices from India. Right? They engage with them on Twitter, they engage with the readers on Twitter, they tell them, okay, listen, why don't you sub here, why don't you sub there? They're very approachable. Right? And they're doing their bit to make sure there are more authors coming out. And I'm sure it will happen. It will happen.
Yeah,
we'll be in a much better place 4, 5 years down.
What everyone would want to see is this building into this unstoppable sort of momentum, right? Where every year there are at least 5 books by Indian SFF writers from a whole gamut of experiences, not just restricted to, urban privileged people, reflective of multiple versions of India, available anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And that's something
5, 6 years down the line, we'll have a good sample size to work with.
I think that's something everyone agrees on. Yeah.
Thank you, IIHS, for hosting us. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Anjali, for having me on the panel. Thank you, and you've been a great audience. Thank you.